Endearing Connections and Culinary Capers, Chronicles of Love and Family, Part 2. Old Mr. Hunt refused to believe that the Yorks were unaffected by the recent commotion caused by the Hunts. He suspected that Serenity might be feeling the pressure now. However, upon reaching Wiltspoon School, they discovered that Serenity's bookshop was closed. Why isn't it open for business? It's already 8 o'clock, and the sign says they open at this time. Old Mr. Hunt muttered, his frustration evident as he noticed the shop's closed shutters. He criticized Serenity for being a poor businessperson. Mike observed the surroundings and clarified, "Granddad, today is Saturday. The school is closed, and these shops mainly cater to students. They wouldn't open when school isn't in session." In response, old Mr. Hunt grumbled, "That brat used to keep the shop open on weekends. Ever since she became the wife of a wealthy man, I guess the shop's profits don't matter much to her anymore. Mike, if she refuses to cooperate, we might need to change our plans and convince her to hand over the business to you." Mike explained, "Serenity started the shop with her friend, Granddad. She could only venture into business because of her friend's support. The friend comes from a well-to-do family, they make their money through real estate and rentals. Apparently, her aunt is married to a local businessman. The whole family is business savvy. Taking over Serenity's bookshop wasn't a feasible option." "The brat's lucky," old Mr. Hunt commented, his jealousy palpable. Not only were members of the public envious of Serenity's fortune, even her own grandfather couldn't handle her newfound affluence. Even though Serenity had married well, she didn't share her wealth with her family. Since the shop was closed, old Mr. Hunt turned to John and asked, "Should we head to your house, then?" John's opinion mattered most to old Mr. Hunt. His sons and other grandsons were essentially there to bolster their numbers. The rest of the family had already returned to their hometown. Staying in the city was expensive. Old Mr. Hunt felt the pinch for his sons and grandsons. He was reluctant to exhaust their earnings while they were still working, let alone using up their savings. That's why, when old Mr. Hunt's wife needed surgery in the city, he initially considered Serenity and Liberty. Why use his family's money when he could utilize theirs? His sons and grandsons constituted the family, and their finances were intertwined. However, his granddaughters would marry into other families, and their financial resources would shift accordingly. From old Mr. Hunt's view, there was no reason for him to be concerned about their financial matters. He had initially attempted to manipulate Serenity and Liberty since they were doing well in life. However, the plan had backfired, causing not only the sisters to stand their ground but also leading to financial setbacks for his sons and grandsons. He harbored resentment toward the sisters, especially Serenity. She had married into wealth, and her in-laws were affluent. Why couldn't she share some of her prosperity with her family? A small contribution could make a significant difference. Old Mr. Hunt's hopes included driving a wedge between Zachary and Serenity, even leading them to divorce. He wished for Serenity to lose everything and for Harriet's plastic surgery to be successful, allowing her to take Serenity's place. As they approached Serenity's gated community, old Mr. Hunt's envy surged upon hearing about Zachary's numerous properties. His own son's estate in the hometown, although beautiful, couldn't compete with the grandeur of the urban structures. A visit to Wildridge Manor had caused a commotion. Though they couldn't enter, they glimpsed the manor through the gate gaps, admiring its size and beauty. Old Mr. Hunt's envy intensified as he imagined himself residing there. "Never mind, then. Let's find Liberty. What type of business is she involved in?" "She's running an F&B establishment, a breakfast place." "Oh, right, a breakfast diner. We can at least have a complimentary breakfast there." Upon learning about Liberty's new business, old Mr. Hunt didn't hold back his complaints about her refusal to lend $1 million to his grandson and her unwillingness to provide financial assistance. He even took the opportunity to vent his frustration toward his deceased son, Scott, for having raised two daughters who were seemingly disloyal. In old Mr. Hunt's eyes, Serenity and Liberty were the cause of his exasperation. Returning to the car, old Mr. Hunt encouraged his sons and grandsons to take advantage of Liberty's breakfast diner. They could conveniently enjoy meals at her establishment whenever they visited the city. After all, it was family, and he believed that Liberty couldn't object if they chose not to pay. Arriving at Liberty's breakfast diner, however, they were met with a closed establishment. Old Mr. Hunt remained in the car, expressing his frustration. "What's going on with these girls? None of their businesses seem to be operating. Maybe they should just hand them over to you, since they don't seem interested in running them." Mike and the others found this situation puzzling. While it was expected for Serenity's bookstore to be closed on weekends, Liberty's breakfast diner should have been open for business. Unbeknownst to Serenity and Liberty, their money-seeking relatives were searching for them. The sisters were on their way to their hometown, a journey that took over an hour due to heavy traffic. Upon reaching their parents' home, Serenity and Liberty were filled with nostalgia. Looking at the house, they remembered the happy times when their parents, Scott and Lisa, were still alive. Zachary and Mrs. Stone had brought along their security personnel for added safety. With everyone on guard for potential conflicts, it was a wise decision to have security present. Given the limited parking space in the driveway, some vehicles were moved to the town square. As Serenity stepped out of the car, she could hear her grandmother shouting, "Don't dump that here! This is my grandson's property! How dare you say this belongs to those girls? Move your vehicle immediately and take those bricks and gravel with you." Serenity had arranged for truckloads of construction materials, bricks, gravel, and sand, to be delivered to her parents' home. However, old Mrs. Hunt was now preventing the truck drivers from unloading the materials in front of her gate. Her use of profanity was unrestrained when she discovered that Serenity was behind this. Known for her confrontational behavior in the neighborhood, old Mrs. Hunt's voice carried far enough to attract the attention of nosy neighbors. Soon, other curious neighbors emerged from their homes, drawn by the commotion. Speculations and discussions started among them. Are Serenity and Liberty back to renovate the house? Let's ask Mrs. Deli, she might know. I heard they're here to rebuild their parents' house. The girls have achieved success, so they've returned to reclaim their family home. Serenity's family home was situated on a large piece of land, but not all of it had been gifted by old Mr. Hunt. His favoritism led to allocating a mere 400 square feet to Serenity's father. Scott and Lisa had acquired the remaining land by purchasing wasteland from others and engaging in land swaps with neighbors. People are saying that Serenity, as the wife of the richest man, shouldn't be vying for the house. It might come off as greedy. There was a faction that believed Serenity shouldn't be fighting for ownership of the house. However, someone quickly stood up in defense of Serenity, arguing, "Considering what her grandparents did to her and her sister, she has every right to fight for the house. Why should John be handed the house for free? I thought John was Scott's adopted son." Scott's name was mostly recognized by the older generation, not so much among the younger crowd. The younger generation's unfamiliarity with Scott, Serenity, and Liberty was largely due to the Hunt family's efforts to erase their presence from the town. The Hunts had gone to the extent of relocating Scott's and Lisa's graves without informing the sisters, making it impossible for them to visit their parents' final resting place. On Serenity's last visit to town, the Hunts were absent. She spent her time talking to fellow townspeople and acquaintances. Mrs. Deli interjected, "Scott and Lisa never mentioned adopting John when they were alive. The adoption only became known after their passing." The Hunt family took advantage of it after forcing Scott and Lisa's daughters out. There are doubts about the authenticity of the adoption papers. Why would John refer to Chris as dad if he's Scott's adopted son? In that case, Chris should be his uncle. The crowd was taken aback, collectively perplexed by these revelations. It was common knowledge that old Mr. and Mrs. Hunt had a particular fondness for their grandson John due to his apparent capabilities. Although John visited his grandparents once a year, they showered him with affection. Old Mr. and Mrs. Hunt had distributed Scott's house, vacant land, and farmland to John. Their intention was to demolish Serenity's family home and merge it with the adjacent empty land to construct a villa. This plan was devised to avoid conflicts between John and his younger brother. John has dutifully visited Scott's and Lisa's graves each day, fulfilling his responsibilities as a son. As a result, he believes he's entitled to Scott's inheritance. Serenity and Liberty have married into other families and have their own lives. Why would they return to contest the inheritance? Old Mrs. Hunt was making a scene, expressing her opinions loudly. Walking behind the commotion, Serenity, Liberty, and their group overheard old Mrs. Hunt's words, which provided clarity to the situation. It became evident why the Hunts had relocated Scott's and Lisa's graves without informing the sisters. The Hunts orchestrated the relocation to facilitate John's role as a son so he could secure his claim to their parents' inheritance. Think about it. Isn't inheritance traditionally passed on to sons? Did your married daughters ever contest for a share of the inheritance? Old Mrs. Hunt posed this question to the onlookers. In the town where the Hunt family resided, a local tradition favored leaving family assets to sons, as they were typically the primary caregivers for their elders. Daughters, on the other hand, tended to visit less frequently. Those without sons might have their sons-in-law carry on the family name, although this was considered less preferable. Certain families regarded nephews as equivalent to immediate family, choosing to bequeath the family fortune to nephews rather than daughters. Ultimately, the irony was that these nephews often proved indifferent when their elderly relatives needed care. The responsibility often fell on the daughter's shoulders regardless. These nephews believed that the presence of daughters meant they would be well taken care of. This mindset resulted in elderly parents who favored nephews over daughters facing the stark reality that their care would ultimately be undertaken by their daughters. Of course, many families with only daughters had successfully broken free from these traditional patterns, leaving all inheritance to their daughters. They planned their wills ahead of time to ensure their daughters were provided for. Different families had different approaches and beliefs when it came to inheritance and family dynamics. Old Mrs. Hunt's rhetorical question had a silencing effect on families with sons, reaffirming the town's unspoken tradition that family fortunes were typically inherited by sons. Sons would also take on the responsibility of caring for their aging parents. However, Serenity was determined to voice her perspective. She stated, "While it's true that this town has an unwritten tradition of passing family wealth to sons, to oversee the well-being of their parents in their final days, my parents didn't have a son. They only had my sister and me. Therefore, our parents' inheritance rightfully belongs to us." Grandmother, could you please clarify when my parents adopted a son, if at all? Was this adoption formalized during their lifetime? Are there any official documents we can review? We have never been informed of any alterations to our family lineage. Serenity's voice rang out, capturing the attention of those around her. With Zachary at her side and surrounded by a protective team of security personnel, a path opened up through the crowd, leading toward the gate of Serenity's ancestral home. Liberty, meanwhile, entrusted Sunny to Jim's care, ensuring the young boy could enjoy some playtime nearby without witnessing the ongoing confrontation. Accompanied by her own security detail, Mrs. Stone and her daughter followed behind Serenity and Zachary. Mrs. Stone's demeanor revealed her underlying discomfort. She had spent years trying to locate her sister, and despite successfully reuniting with her 16 years ago, a tragic car accident had claimed her sister's life. Thankfully, her sister had left behind 2 daughters, providing Mrs. Stone with some semblance of solace, especially in the sight of Liberty, who closely resembled her mother. Mrs. Stone had yearned to visit her sister's former residence and grave, but due to the mysterious relocation of her sister's final resting place, she had been denied this opportunity. Full of indignation, she ardently supported her nieces in their quest to reclaim their rightful possessions. Old Mrs. Hunt's comments only fueled Mrs. Stone's frustration. Her sister and brother-in-law had tirelessly worked to establish their home. Yet, manipulative individuals had exploited her niece's youth, inexperience, and absence to unjustly occupy the house. The Hunts had forcibly expelled the children from their family home and hometown. Now that Serenity and her sister had returned to reclaim their inheritance, the elderly woman was making claims about the legitimacy of her sister's adopted son being the rightful heir. It was a transparent attempt to wrest control of the property. Determined, Mrs. Stone resolved to extract information from the Hunts regarding the whereabouts of Lisa's and Scott's graves. As for the estate, arguing would likely prove futile. The most effective course of action was to seek legal recourse. Both the Stones and the Yorks possessed the resources and capabilities to assist the sisters in reclaiming their ancestral home. Liberty and Serenity have returned, murmurs circulated among the onlookers. Serenity's presence was recognizable. She had come the previous year to address damaging rumors propagated by her grandparents, meeting with many in the town. Meanwhile, Liberty's physical appearance had undergone a transformation, now bearing a striking resemblance to her mother. It seems Liberty grows more similar to Lisa with each passing day, some commented. The name Howden held significance. It was Lisa's maiden name and the family name of her adoptive parents. Before her adoption, Lisa had a different name entirely, a fact known only to Mrs. Stone. Serenity, Liberty, your timing couldn't be more perfect. What is the meaning of this? Understand that the moment you left this house and town, this property was ours. My son left this house for us. The ownership belongs to us, and we have the right to bestow it upon whomever we choose. However, it won't be given to you, as you have both married into other families. Old Mrs. Hunt's voice carried a mix of defensive assertion and guilt. Seeing the sisters arrive with a sizable entourage prompted a twinge of remorse within her. During her time in the hospital, she had heard of Serenity's remarkable achievements and how she had risen to great heights, even becoming the wife of a wealthy man. This newfound knowledge stirred a pang of guilt within old Mrs. Hunt. After all, she and her husband had forcibly occupied the house and property, capitalizing on the sisters' youth and vulnerability. They had even gone so far as to cast them out. Serenity was only around 12 years old when she and Liberty were driven out of their own home. Despite their attempts to return in the subsequent years to visit their parents' graves, their presence was met with violence and harsh scolding from their grandparents, who used to drive them away. The beatings were so severe that the sisters refrained from returning for several years. The connection between the two parties was severed. It wasn't until Liberty's impending marriage that their grandparents resurfaced, shamelessly demanding a betrothal gift of $300,000 from the Browns. However, Liberty steadfastly refused their request and turned them away. For the next 3 years, There was no contact from their grandparents until old Mrs. Hunt fell ill. Desperation for financial assistance brought them back into contact with Serenity and Liberty, whom they believed were thriving. Old Mrs. Hunt was aware of the unfavorable impression they left on the townspeople, but her audacity and brazenness shielded her from direct confrontation. Now that her vested interests were at stake, old Mrs. Hunt's shamelessness was on full display. "I have never witnessed married daughters returning to their parents' home to fight for ownership," she muttered audibly. However, when met with Zachary's cold gaze, her fervent yelling morphed into soft mumblings. Yet, she puffed up her chest, unwavering in her confidence. She remained unafraid, insistent that her status as Scott's mother gave her the rightful claim to his property. "Grandmother, enlighten me. Who did my parents adopt as their son when they were still alive? You vehemently stated that this is your grandson's house. Which of your grandsons is the rightful owner?" "My sister and I possess the legitimate right to inherit our parents' home. We are prepared to fight if it is rightfully ours, and we will not back down," Serenity coolly challenged old Mrs. Hunt. Turning to the truck driver, she gave clear instructions. "Mr. Driver, unload these bricks there, in the open space." Guiding the truck's course, she directed the driver to empty the bricks on the vacant area to the right of the entrance, a place significant to her family. When Serenity and Liberty's parents were alive, they had advised the sisters to acquire more land for housing. The intention was for the siblings to each build a home on the land, becoming supportive neighbors who could rely on each other and fend off any mistreatment from the community. "You're not allowed to unload here. This isn't permitted. It's my house." Old Mrs. Hunt quickly recognized the unfolding situation and rushed forward, planting herself in the center of the open space. With her arms outstretched, she bellowed, "Who dares to unload those bricks here? Crush me if you dare." Observing the scene, Zachary made a commanding gesture, prompting 2 bodyguards to approach. They positioned themselves on either side of old Mrs. Hunt and gently took hold of her arms, leading her away from the situation. "What is the meaning of this? Unhand me. Let go of me." Old Mrs. Hunt's protests filled the air. However, the unfortunate truth was that old Mrs. Hunt was simply an elderly woman, lacking the strength to break free from the grasp of the 2 bodyguards. These 2 individuals refrained from causing her any harm, opting instead to lead her away from the scene. Seeing this unfold, other members of the Hunt family hurried over to intervene. However, the combined security teams of the Yorks and the Stones moved in tandem to deter them, effectively preventing their approach. "I'm being assaulted, they're attacking me," old Mrs. Hunt cried out, clearly outnumbered and resorting to collapsing on the ground as soon as her feet touched the earth. Slapping her own thigh, she falsely accused the others of harming her. Nevertheless, the bystanders present in town were merely spectators, reluctant to get involved in the heated confrontation. Some among them were even recording videos of the incident. By capturing the events, these recordings would serve as evidence against any potential distortion or manipulation of the truth later on. This would ensure transparency and prevent a repeat of the prior year's events, which had led to harm befalling the 2 orphans. Under Serenity's direction, truckloads of bricks, sand, and gravel were deposited in the open space in front of her family home. Serenity was well aware that, once she and her entourage left the town, the antagonistic locals would likely remove the building materials. Nonetheless, the symbolic act of unloading these materials was intended to serve as a starting point for her battle to reclaim the house. "Quick, call your grandfather and the others," old Mrs. Hunt urged, delivering loud slaps to her thigh that left it reddened. Yet, her plea fell on deaf ears. Residents were unmoved to aid her. Rising from the ground and dusting off her pants, she continued shouting at her grandchildren, asking them to summon their husbands, as well as her elder sons and grandsons, to return home urgently. Within their extensive family, the two eldest grandsons of old Mrs. Hunt held the most influence. Among the bystanders, Noah, one of these grandsons, contemplated intervening but ultimately hesitated. The formidable presence of Serenity and her well-prepared security team kept him rooted in place, dissuading him from taking further action. Moreover, Serenity had strategically assembled a team of formidable bodyguards, including those from Zachary and Mrs. Stone, all of whom were experienced and formidable in combat. This presence of strength further deterred Noah from intervening on his grandmother's behalf, prompting him to remain in the background and watch as his elders clashed. Liberty, Serenity, you're both ungrateful grandchildren, disrespectful and ungrateful. Old Mrs. Hunt's voice reverberated, seeking to attract attention by publicly denouncing her granddaughters. Venting her frustration, she criticized the sisters for not providing financial support during her old age. She accused them of secretly hoping for her demise while scheming to claim her house. Why hasn't lightning struck down these disrespectful granddaughters? Heavenly powers, awaken and observe. I have two ungrateful granddaughters right here. They've abandoned me, offering no financial assistance or support for my medical needs in my hour of sickness. Now, they've returned to snatch my home and cast me aside. Old Mrs. Hunt's tirade continued, her words infused with bitterness. Amid her diatribe, Serenity approached, prompting old Mrs. Hunt to take a defensive step back. Astonished by this unexpected approach, she questioned with trepidation, "What are you planning? Have I said something wrong? You are the ungrateful one." Serenity's lips curled into a scornful expression as she began her retort, "Only 16 years have passed since my parents' demise, and we were awarded $1.2 million in compensation. You, Granddad, your children, and their children came to our house, leaving us without even a place to stand. You drove me and Liberty to give up that money in order to assert your claim to a share. It's undeniable that you and Granddad were entitled to a portion, but the question is, how much? Back then, you stipulated that Liberty and I need not provide financial support during your lifetime. Your words were etched in black and white. Perhaps you've obliterated your copy, but Liberty holds onto hers. I believe the town committee possesses a copy as well. Witnesses from the town who observed this are still here today. Shall we call upon them to corroborate your claims? As for the house, does it truly belong to you? My father's name remains on the title deed. You and Granddad indeed hold a share of my parents' legacy, but you cannot claim the entirety. Liberty and I hold an equal share in those possessions too. Boo. And regarding your assertion of adopting a son for my parents, did they consent to it? Has John referred to my parents as Dad and Mom? He still addresses his own parents as such. Did you assume that barring us from our parents' graves and allowing him to pay homage yearly makes him the sole heir to my parents' legacy? Let me be clear, that's a fantasy. Serenity's tone turned icy as she added, Grandmom, by all means, summon Granddad and the rest back. Liberty and I have returned today to claim our rightful inheritance from our parents. Have them return so we can divide everything equitably. Yet again, we will not waver if we're entitled, and we will not battle for what is not rightfully ours. Serenity. Old Mrs. Hunt retorted in an outburst of anger. Pointing her finger at Serenity, she cursed, "You are daughters, what claim do daughters have to inherit family property? Your father was my son. Following his demise, his inheritance is ours. Leave this place." What audacity do married daughters possess to return to their parental home, vying for their family's assets? Have you no shame? Regardless, your father is deceased. Every possession he left behind now belongs to me. I won't cower before the people you've brought here. You cannot seize the house unless you defeat us to our demise. What agreement? What money? My son passed away, therefore his insurance payout rightfully belongs to my husband and me. You are merely young girls. We demonstrated kindness by bestowing upon you $200,000 for sustenance, ensuring you didn't languish in destitution. I recall no agreement of any sort. Your neglect to financially support me is the embodiment of filial impropriety. If you don't provide us with money, we shall haunt you even beyond death. Old Mrs. Hunt, considering Serenity's current status as the wife of a wealthy family, attempted to negate the past agreement she had signed. Her audacity knew no bounds, especially now that she aimed to secure advantages for her grandsons. As long as Serenity would provide financial assistance, she planned to allow her grandsons to initiate their own enterprises. Given the affluence of Serenity's in-laws, parting with a few $1,000,000 should be a minor matter, right? Old Mrs. Hunt, this is inaccurate. The agreement you signed with Serenity and Liberty was a widely known and witnessed event in town. The Howden family was also present. Do you truly believe you can disavow it now? Mrs. Deli intervened, who had been particularly close to Lisa. Mrs. Deli harbored deep sympathy and empathy for Liberty and Serenity when Scott and Lisa passed away. Yet, her own frailty rendered her incapable of extending more meaningful assistance at the time. She could only observe helplessly as the sisters were ostracized. With Serenity and Liberty having returned to assert their rights, Mrs. Deli wholeheartedly lent her support to their cause. Yes, it was you who explicitly declared that they needn't shoulder the responsibility of supporting you in your lifetime or organizing your funeral upon your demise. Given that you didn't raise them, how could you muster the audacity to demand money from them? Your sons and grandsons have profited immensely. Why don't ask them for financial assistance instead? Your entire clan amassed wealth by exploiting their misfortune, yet you're targeting these orphaned girls. Your family's actions have crossed the line, inviting divine retribution. You're aged now, how much longer can you expect to live? Aren't you fearful of descending into the depths of hell after your passing, with no chance of rebirth? Despite the town's prevailing sentiment that married daughters shouldn't return to contest family property, the excessive actions of old Mrs. Hunt and her kin prompted the townspeople to intervene. They're inherently shameless individuals. They all live opulent lives, inhabiting grand villas and driving luxury vehicles. John himself commands an annual salary of $1 million. When old Mrs. Hunt fell ill, no one stepped up to cover the expenses. Instead, they expected Liberty and her sister to bear the burden. They reaped the benefits and placed the blame on the sisters. Do they take the sisters for fools? The Hunts' hometown was well versed in the scandal that made headlines the previous year. Many of them had even embraced technology to lend online support to Serenity and her sister, exposing the cruelty and shamelessness of old Mrs. Hunt's family. Subsequently, upon learning that John and his relatives had suffered professional setbacks due to the backlash of the online uproar, the townspeople interpreted it as a form of karma. Meddlesome do-gooders, Liberty exclaimed with force, the people of this town aren't merely sticking their noses into our business. They are standing up for justice and speaking the truth. Silently, Zachary stood beside Serenity, silently bolstering her with his presence. His penetrating gaze was enough to quell the normally unruly Hunts, leaving them hesitant and guilty. In her obstinate pursuit, old Mrs. Hunt stood alone, persistently shouting in desperation. However, her obstinacy was futile in the face of Serenity and her supporters. Mrs. Stone approached, aligning herself with Serenity and her sister. Her gaze was equally chilly, resonating with her commanding presence. Having actively managed Stone Group alongside her husband during her younger years, she had left an indelible mark on Witherspoon's business landscape, ascending to a prominent position. This dominance was palpable as she bore down with her intense stare and stern expression. While you may have a claim to Scott's inheritance, as in-laws, you possess no rights over Lisa's legacy. I am Lisa's elder sister. While she began life as a fisher, a series of twists and turns led her to become part of the Houghton family, only later becoming a Hunt through marriage. It was a lamentable twist of fate that Lisa entered the Hunt family through marriage. Mrs. Stone couldn't help but wonder about the injustices Lisa might have faced during her lifetime. Considering having only 2 daughters, in an era marked by stringent family planning and patriarchal norms, Mrs. Stone could easily envision the challenges her sister endured within the Hunt family. For years, I searched for my sister. Finally reuniting with news of her, I didn't anticipate. This house was erected after my sister and her husband were married, making it a conjugal property. You have a claim to your son's half, yet you have no jurisdiction over my sister's portion. You can only access a fraction of the estate from your son's share, leaving my sister's half untouched. Mrs. Stone's voice remained composed. I haven't come here to engage in a quarrel. My sole purpose is to stand by my niece's side and, as Lisa's sister, to revisit the place she once inhabited. By the way, it would save everyone much trouble if you were to vacate the premises willingly. If not, we'll pursue legal action against your unauthorized occupancy of someone else's property. We'll reclaim the house even if it means going to court. The court will decide the fair division of the property. So, don't fantasize about retaining what rightfully belongs to my nieces. In the same vein, they won't lay claim to what doesn't rightfully belong to them. The townspeople who hailed from the Hunt's hometown exchanged knowing glances. It seemed that Lisa's sister had located Serenity and Liberty. Although the Hunts were aware of Mrs. Stone's relationship with Serenity, they were cautious not to spread this information around town. For the Hunts, the fact that Lisa's sister had identified Serenity and her sister was an unwelcome revelation. Wasn't John a senior executive of a subsidiary within Stone Group? It was rumored that due to a conflict with the Stones' cherished daughter, John had lost his job and his annual $1 million salary along with it. Since then, John struggled to find new employment. Furthermore, whispers circulated about John's aspirations to join York Corporation, believing his past experience in Stone Group gave him the upper hand to challenge Stone Group from within. Little did he know, the head of York Corporation was none other than Serenity's husband. The townspeople were inclined to believe that the Hunts were due for a bout of misfortune and accountability. They had exploited Scott and Lisa's misfortune for far too long. Now that Lisa's maternal family had finally emerged, the Hunts were likely in for a rough ride. Should Lisa's sister inquire within the town, she would undoubtedly uncover the extent of the Hunts' ill-treatment of Lisa. Old Mr. and Mrs. Hunt had 6 children, 4 sons and 2 daughters. Among them, Scott was the one they resented. Despite their animosity, he proved to be the most dutiful, always at their side when they're unwell, arranging medical visits and shouldering the expenses. It was Scott who tirelessly cared for them, financially and emotionally. Lisa demonstrated her filial devotion as a daughter-in-law, yet her inability to bear a son drew the old couple's disdain. They subjected her to scorn, mistreatment, and even coerced Scott into divorcing her. However, Scott couldn't fathom severing ties with Lisa or abandoning their daughters. To him, his children's gender was irrelevant, his love remained steadfast. Then let's proceed to court. Let's see who flinches first. Old Mrs. Hunt's voice resonated with determination. Don't presume that you can stake a claim simply by stating your relation to Lisa. Don't assume that I'll cower just because you're affluent and influential. I won't be intimidated. Old Mrs. Hunt pointed an accusing finger at Serenity and Liberty, berating them once more. "You ungrateful granddaughters are evidently intent on driving me to an early grave. Let me make this clear, as long as I live, don't even entertain the thought of erecting a structure on my land. Serenity, despite your newfound wealth, you've returned to contest this house. Your riches haven't tempered your heartlessness. Your cousins have suffered job losses due to your vengeance. Their businesses have crumbled. Yet, you're still unsatisfied, and now you seek to wrest this house from us. Can you possibly be more brazen?" Old Mrs. Hunt's tirade escalated her anger, inciting within her a desire to physically strike Serenity. Zachary's expression darkened, and the York's bodyguards prepared to intervene. Unexpectedly, Noah leapt forward, embracing his grandmother tightly. "Grandmom, vent all you want, but please don't resort to violence against them. Please, don't lay a hand on them." Serenity alone possessed the capacity to handle all of them, let alone Mr. York, who stood by with his security detail. Even if Noah rallied his cousins, they stood no chance against her, not to mention his aunt, mother, and others. The women excelled in verbal jousting, sufficient against ordinary adversaries, but it was a perilous path to challenge someone with Serenity's martial prowess. Noah, who had tasted defeat twice at Serenity's hands, remained deeply wary of her abilities. "Grandmom, you must understand. Serenity is immensely skilled. I once enlisted a group of hooligans to confront her, and they were all soundly defeated. She, however, emerged unscathed." Old Mrs. Hunt was left speechless. Recalling the events of the previous year, a particular incident stood out. Old Mrs. Hunt's young grandson, aiming to reprimand Serenity for refusing to cover a medical bill, led a group that halted her car. However, their intentions backfired disastrously as Serenity skillfully dispatched them, leading to the grandson's detention for 15 days. Surprisingly, Serenity emerged from the ordeal unscathed, with the police declaring her actions as justifiable self-defense. Upon learning of her grandson's fate and the incident's outcome, old Mrs. Hunt experienced a deep pang of distress. Her resentment towards Serenity intensified as a result. "Mother, let's wait for Dad's return." "Grandmom, please remain composed." The others present also attempted to calm old Mrs. Hunt. Their stance had been unreasonable from the outset. Although old Mrs. Hunt was notoriously obstinate and irrational, her conduct was ineffective in the face of Mr. Zachary, Mrs. Stone, and others who commanded authority and status. Mrs. Stone had indicated her intention to bring the matter to court. While old Mrs. Hunt might lack legal understanding, her family members possessed ample knowledge. Engaging in a lawsuit would undoubtedly undermine their chances of victory. Old Mr. and Mrs. Hunt might secure a share of Scott's inheritance, but full ownership of the house would remain elusive. If old Mrs. Hunt instigated proceedings and Serenity counteracted, she might even be required to compensate Serenity for her actions. Given the history of mistreatment, Serenity was unlikely to be lenient or nostalgic. After all, they had subjected Serenity to frequent bullying in the past. During her junior high years, Liberty resided at the school, while Serenity attended elementary school while staying with her parents. Their cousins frequently targeted Serenity. In Lisa's presence, confrontations frequently arose as she defended her daughter against her sisters-in-law. "Serenity, Grandmom is aged and prone to impulsive remarks. I implore you not to engage in conflict with her. You've returned home infrequently, so why not visit my place for a cup of coffee?" Having persuaded his grandmother, Noah's tone shifted to one of flattery, inviting Serenity to his home. "Liberty, Serenity, regardless of the situation, we remain family. Your parents may have passed, but with your return, consider this house your own. Let's proceed to your uncle's residence. You've been here since early morning without breakfast, haven't you? Would you like me to prepare something for you? Observing Noah's attempt to invite serenity and liberty, Stuart's wife followed suit, adopting a gentler demeanor as she extended an invitation. Recognizing that Serenity and her sister now possessed formidable support, the Hunts concluded that mirroring their aggressive approach would yield no gain. With an inability to confront them directly, the Hunts sought a gentler approach, hoping to temporarily pacify Serenity. Upon Harriet's completion of plastic surgery and acquisition of Serenity's mannerisms and speech, their scheme would progress. Harriet's formal replacement of Serenity would mark the next phase. Subsequently, the entire family could aspire to a comfortable life, residing alongside the wealthy York family. The vision of the Yorks boasting a staggering net worth of $100 billion evoked envy from the Hunts, who longed to be younger and capable of contending with Serenity for the same status. Observing her daughters-in-law extend invitations to Serenity, old Mrs. Hunt recognized that her prolonged outburst had only resulted in her becoming the subject of ridicule in her hometown. Acknowledging this, she decided to soften her approach, her expression relaxing as she addressed Liberty and Serenity. Liberty, Serenity, your aunt has a valid point. Ultimately, we are family. Rather than argue, let's engage in a conversation. I wish to refrain from further dispute. We'll await your granddads and the others' return to facilitate a discussion. Irrespective of the situation, this house remains mine. Serenity responded with a disdainful smile, I share your sentiment, Grandmom. Let us settle this in court. Taking the matter to court aimed to ascertain their respective inheritance proportions. According to Audrey, this house represented a shared asset between their parents following their union, half belonging to their mother and the other half to their father. This residence occupied a 1,100 square foot area, with Lisa and Scott's share to be evenly distributed among the sisters and the two elder members. As for Lisa's portion, it could only be distributed among the sisters, devoid of connection to old Mr. and Mrs. Hunt if the Howdens, her adoptive parents, relinquished their rights. I require no hospitality either. This is our residence, and I am returning to my home. Serenity spoke resolutely, leading Zachary into the very house her parents had painstakingly constructed. This was her sanctuary. In her youth, she had been unable to protect this property from her grandparents' appropriation, leading to her and her sister's forced expulsion. Surveying the house, Serenity's gaze encompassed familiar items her parents had procured. Old Mr. and Mrs. Hunt resided here, yet their inertia had hindered the replacement of these belongings. Liberty ushered Mrs. Stone and Elisa inside, an action old Mrs. Hunt sought to thwart. However, Noah intervened, redirecting his grandmother away from the commotion before issuing a caution. Grandmom, Serenity possesses remarkable power, proficient in kickboxing. Best not to provoke her further. The individuals accompanying her are equally formidable. Allow them to inspect the house. The property remains stationary, unmovable. We can address this matter when Grandad, Mike, and John return. Uttering these words, old Mrs. Hunt harbored resentment, muttering, so many years have passed. Why didn't those two girls perish outside? Now they've returned to contest the family property. Married daughters cease to be family members, lacking a claim to inheritance. If they possess such capability, they should contend for their in-laws' property. She and her daughters-in-law had never returned to their parental homes to vie for property rights. How audacious of Liberty and her sister to do so now. If they succeed in seizing the house, her humiliation would be insurmountable. She'll be unable to face society. Noah, despite his less than stellar academic record, possessed some legal knowledge. Grandmom, even if you and Granddad combined your shares for this house, they would still be inferior to the sisters. Moreover, you have no entitlement to Aunt Lisa's half of the inheritance. Furthermore, John merely expressed a desire to be adopted into Uncle Scott's family and inherit the family line verbally. This was never formalized. John continues to reside with Uncle Chris, addressing him as Dad. Thus, his adoption into Uncle Scott's family is invalid. He continued, "If you wish to bestow Uncle Scott's inheritance upon John, you must await Uncle Chris's passing. Even then, John's inheritance would not be all-encompassing. My dad, my aunts, and we would also possess a share." Old Mrs. Hunt was left momentarily stupefied after absorbing this information. "We won't stand a chance in the lawsuit?" Old Mrs. Hunt inquired further. "This house was erected by your Uncle Scott, and I'm his mother, yet I cannot inherit it?" "You can, but not entirely. As I mentioned before, you can only inherit a quarter of Uncle Scott's share. The same rule applies to Granddad," Noah patiently explained to his grandmother. "I don't care. Regardless, your Granddad and I reside in this house. It's our property, and we have the authority to decide its fate. Will I be arrested if we lose the lawsuit?" Noah warned, "If the law is upheld, both you and Granddad might be forced to vacate the premises. Causing disturbances might lead to arrest. Grandmom, it's a frightening experience to be detained. It's better to stay within the bounds of the law." The memory of his 15-day detention had left a deep impression on him, deterring him from engaging in any harmful behavior. But aren't Serenity and Liberty daughters? Can daughters inherit family property too? In accordance with inheritance law, daughters are indeed entitled to inherit. Why aren't those darn girls deceased? If they had perished earlier, they wouldn't be here fighting for the family property. While old Mrs. Hunt lacked knowledge of legal matters, Noah's enlightened her to the limitations she and her husband faced. The idea of giving all of Scott's family assets to John seemed unfeasible. In her frustration, she couldn't help but curse Serenity and her sister for audaciously returning to reclaim their parents' property. Unperturbed by the commotion outside, Serenity led Zachary through her family's residence. Despite being constructed nearly 2 decades ago, the house remained a bastion of memories and familiarity. Stopping in front of a room, Serenity recounted to Zachary, "This room belonged to Liberty and me. I was quite timid and couldn't sleep alone, so I shared the room with my sister. I was also a restless sleeper, often pushing my sister, leaving her without space. Once, she even tumbled off the bed and ended up underneath it. She woke up, feeling sand on the ground, and called our mom, claiming there was sand on the bed." Serenity's lips curved into a smile as she reminisced about her childhood antics, though her eyes eventually grew moist. The house remained, but their parents were no longer there. In those days, Serenity would call out to her mom upon returning from school, and her mother's response was always certain. If one's parents were alive, there was a place to return to; if they were gone, only the path leading back remained. I can still recall the day my sister and I were expelled from this house. It was raining, and they wouldn't even allow us to take umbrellas. We were soaked, crying while glancing back. Their cruelty knew no bounds, they shut and locked the door. Serenity's voice quivered as she shared these memories with Zachary. She continued, "During that time, I couldn't fathom why we couldn't inhabit the house our parents had built, our very own home. Dealing with the loss of my parents was incredibly difficult. I would dream of them in my sleep, yet they would slip away when I called out to them. Why did Granddad and Grandmom subject my sister and me to such treatment?" Reflecting on the past, the challenges were not exclusive to Serenity and her sister, they also weighed heavily on Mrs. Stone and Elisa. Mrs. Stone's eyes had been misty for some time. If only she had located her sister sooner, perhaps everything could have taken a different turn. While she couldn't alter her sister's fate, she could have protected her two nieces, shielding them from the heartlessness of their relatives in the wake of their parents' sudden demise. They wouldn't have had to experience the fickleness and darkness of human nature. Saran, Zachary expressed his empathy for Serenity as he enveloped her in a warm embrace. The past is behind us now. He had traversed the ordeal of last year's trending topic alongside Serenity. When she had posted her sister's diary to counter the Hunts' claims, the tide of public opinion had turned. Zachary had read his sister-in-law's diary, though he could only muster the courage to read it once, finding the experience immensely heartbreaking. It wasn't always strangers who hurt us most, sometimes, it was our loved ones. Serenity and her sister had been subjected to the most anguish by their own relatives. Elisa fetched 2 tissue packets from her bag, passing one to Zachary, who gratefully accepted it. With Zachary's support, Serenity dabbed at her tears using the tissues. Both Mrs. Stone and Liberty also received tissues from Elisa. Seeing her younger niece receiving comfort during this trying time warmed Mrs. Stone's heart. Conversely, Liberty had no companion after her divorce. Audrey is contemplated finding a suitable partner for her niece once they return to the city, ensuring she had a support system and companion. Given Liberty's less than ideal first marriage, Mrs. Stone believed caution was warranted in her second marriage. Saran, let's focus on the present. You're getting me all teary, Liberty urged, wiping her tears. Nonetheless, the past couldn't help but resurface as they returned to the place laden with memories. Drying her eyes, Mrs. Stone interjected, I'd love to hear interesting anecdotes and stories about your mom. Saran, your youngest cousin is probably more approachable. While your granddad is absent, you could ask him about the relocation of your parents' graves and take us there. Mrs. Stone exhibited keen observation. She had noticed Noah whispering to old Mrs. Hunt earlier, which had promptly curtailed her outburst. Besides, Noah's relatively young age and straightforward nature made him a suitable target. Serenity hummed in acknowledgement and began to move towards the door. I'll accompany you, Zachary offered, joining Serenity in stepping outside. Old Mrs. Hunt and the rest remained gathered outside the house. The atmosphere had grown somber, likely due to a conversation they had with someone well-versed in the law. Serenity and Liberty's return to vie for the house did not concern old Mrs. Hunt's first and fourth children. After all, old Mrs. and Mr. Hunt had repeatedly declared their intent to pass Scott's family property on to John. The other children could only stew in their sense of bias, as John, their parents' favorite, was deemed the most promising and favored child. The sentiment echoed within John's family, aligning with old Mrs. Hunt's perspective. Claiming a portion of Scott's family property seemed like a painful extraction of their flesh. Serenity second and inquired of old Mrs. Hunt, do you have the land use permit? Back then, you should have transferred the house into your name. Old Mrs. Hunt explained, at that time, your dad and I couldn't find their household registration and land use permits. We weren't familiar with these procedures, and we assumed it wouldn't matter. We were living in the house, so who would dare evict us? Those two girls must have taken the household registration and land use permits away. Noah, Serenity is out again, Liberty notified as she observed Zachary and Serenity stepping outside together. Noah's nerves immediately coiled upon hearing this. Fearful of his cousin, he approached Serenity hesitantly, wearing a submissive smile. Serenity, how can I assist you? Where were my parents' graves moved to? Do you know? Serenity's question caught Noah off guard. He was tempted to deny knowledge, but the intensity of Serenity and her husband's gazes deterred him. Reluctantly, he admitted, I know. They were relocated to the woodland at the base of the mountain in Walford Ridge. Aunt Lisa's grave lacks a monument, while Uncle Scott's grave has one. You'll easily spot them once you're there. Serenity, I'm sharing this secretly, so please don't mention that I told you. Granddad doesn't allow us to disclose this. John usually visits Uncle Scott's grave alone every year. As the youngest, I pestered him to let me join a few times, so I've accompanied him and know the location. Armed with the knowledge of her parents' grave sites, Serenity was still cautious. Given the audacity of the hunts, she foresaw the possibility of them being moved again after her departure. She instructed Noah, "This has to remain between us. Don't let anyone know about our conversation." Pointing at the construction materials on the ground, she continued, "While I'm away, you're responsible for safeguarding these piles of sand, gravel, and bricks. If I return and find them missing, I'll hold you accountable, and you'll have to reimburse me for them." Noah was at a loss for words. He had not bargained for such a responsibility. "That's all. You can go," Serenity concluded, dismissing him. Old Mrs. Hunt and the others flocked around him, demanding to know his conversation with Serenity. Noah truthfully conveyed that Serenity had asked him to look after the construction materials. Although old Mrs. Hunt was furious and resorted to cursing, she kept her distance and refrained from confronting Serenity directly, wary of Zachary's presence. "Zachary, let's buy some flowers from town. We'll place them on my parents' graves when we visit," Serenity suggested. "Sure, and let's try not to draw attention when we go. Since we don't reside here, they might relocate the graves as soon as we leave." Given their cruelty and ruthlessness, such actions wouldn't be surprising, Zachary proposed. Agreeing, Serenity turned to her sister and the others to outline their plan. With their arrangements made, they lingered in the old house before eventually departing. They paid visits to Mrs. Deli and the mayor's residences briefly before driving away in their cars. To outsiders, it seemed that Serenity and her group were heading back to the city, unaware of their actual intention to buy flowers in town. En route, Serenity discussed with her sister, Liberty, "Let's consider acquiring a burial plot at the cemetery for Mom and Dad. We'll move their graves there. Not only will it make paying our respects easier, we also won't have to worry about their graves being disturbed. With a constant presence at the cemetery, we can ensure their peace is preserved." Liberty found her sister's suggestion reasonable and responded, "Okay, we'll follow your plan." Zachary checked the time and proposed, "Liberty, Saren, once we arrive in town, let's grab a meal first. We adults might not be hungry, but Sonny is just a kid, and he'll likely get hungry soon." Glancing at the time, Serenity realized that it was nearing noon. She concurred, "Sounds like a plan. We can have lunch first. It's been a while since I've tasted the specialties from our hometown. After we return, we'll immediately start preparing for the lawsuit," Serenity addressed Liberty. Liberty nodded in agreement, having no additional comments. Recognizing that Liberty's shop was about to launch its grand opening and she'd be busy, Serenity thoughtfully stated, "Liberty, I'll handle this matter. Your shop is opening the day after tomorrow, and you'll have a lot on your plate. Jasmine works with me, so she can watch the shop while I take care of the lawsuit." "I appreciate that, Saren. It feels odd, though. As the older sister, I sometimes feel like I'm not contributing much, given how much you're handling," Liberty admitted. Serenity reassured her, "This is what we need to do to reclaim our parents' home. If you think I'm burdening you, it's like you're seeing me as an outsider." Zachary interjected tenderly, holding Serenity's hand, "Saren, you must let me know when you need my assistance. Don't carry everything on your own." Serenity reiterated, "If I can handle it independently, I will. But I won't hesitate to ask for your help when I need it." As she spoke, she playfully covered Sunny's eyes with her hand and gave Zachary a quick kiss. Reacting to the sudden blindness, Sunny attempted to remove his aunt's hand from his face. Serenity removed her hand, revealing a mischievous grin. This was the first time she had expressed her affection for Zachary openly in front of her sister. About to reciprocate the gesture, Zachary hesitated since Sunny's eyes were now uncovered. Sunny stared at his aunt and uncle in bewilderment with his large, bright eyes, making Zachary feel slightly embarrassed to proceed with kissing Serenity. "Aunt Sarah, why did you cover my eyes?" Sunny inquired, puzzled. Liberty chuckled at the innocent query. Serenity replied, "I wanted to play a game of hide and seek with you." Sunny appeared skeptical. After contemplating for a moment, he childishly remarked, "But we're in Uncle Zach's car. We can't play hide and seek here." "You're right, Sunny. We can't play hide and seek in the car. I didn't think of that, but Sunny did. You're so smart." Serenity praised him. Sunny beamed with pride, declaring confidently, "I'm always smart." Laughter filled the air as everyone enjoyed the lighthearted exchange. After arriving in town, having a meal, and taking a brief break, they purchased candles and visited a florist to acquire 2 bouquets of white roses. Following the address provided by Noah Hunt, they reached Scott's and Lisa's graves. The Hunts had only erected a gravestone for Scott, leaving Lisa's resting place unmarked. Noah's information proved invaluable in identifying Lisa's grave. The Hunts' plan aimed to keep Lisa's grave unmarked to prevent visits and tributes. After years of being unable to visit their parents' graves, Serenity and Liberty spent some time crying before the headstones. Meanwhile, Mrs. Stone lingered at her sister's grave, lost in thought before eventually rising and leaving with the group. Upon returning to the city, Liberty was preoccupied with her shop's impending opening. Handling everything single-handedly without assistance, she even brought her son to the shop on an e-bike. Back at their home, Serenity's mood remained somber, and she and Zachary sat together on the balcony swing, seeking comfort in each other's presence. Meanwhile, a figure stood outside All You Can Eat, Hank Brown. Thanks for watching. Part 3 of Chapter 1001 to 1050 will be uploaded soon.